Hello, this is Anthony Vanderwert. In this video, I'm going to discuss role-based access control with Actifio, and specifically how we can use our Active Directory integration to significantly simplify the way we do role-based access control. First up, we need to understand some terminology. In Actifio, we have three terms which we use to describe role-based access control. That is users, roles, and organizations. And even without Active Directory, we can use these things to control who can log in, what rights the logged in user has, in other words, what can they do, and what can they access. So the role determines their rights and the organizations determines their access. If we wish to use Active Directory to simplify this, we can simply map Actifio users to Active Directory users, Actifio roles to Active Directory groups, and Actifio organizations to Active Directory groups. And I'll show you how we do this as we work through the video. Right, let's have a closer look at the way Actifio implements these things. If I log on to my Windows 2008 server, I can start the Active Directory users and computers section. And what I can find here is a list of my Active Directory security groups and my Active Directory users. Now, what we do within Actifio is we can map these security groups and users to Actifio roles and organizations. If I look at a specific example of a user, and I look at myself here, so I double click on Anthony Vanderwert, what I can see as a, rather than change Anthony's name, if I go to member of, what you can see is what groups Anthony's a member of: domain admins, domain users, SQL admins. So what a typical administrator in this area will be doing is making new users and occasionally making new groups and then making users members of groups. So from a AD administrator's perspective, this remains exactly the same. The only difference is they may wish to make some new unique groups so that we can map them to Actifio roles. And we'll see exactly what that looks like in a moment. In terms of security, and more importantly, role-based access control, when I've logged onto the Actifio desktop and I go to the domain manager, I have a security tab with three sections: users, organizations, and roles. This is the role-based access control. Now, if we're not using LDAP integration, then the word LDAP won't appear. That only appears once we've successfully attached Actifio to an Active Directory server. So normally you would create your own users manually. You would normally create roles manually and organizations manually. Now, this doesn't change from the perspective of Active Directory integration. We still have to create organizations and roles. However, the placement of a user into that organization and role can now be done automatically using the Active Directory groups. So just to give some background on what a role is effectively a restricted group of rights. In other words, what tasks can a particular user in a particular role perform? And you can see that's based on these tick boxes here. Obviously, if I wish to restrict the rights of a user, I simply tick less boxes. Organizations are all about access. The all organization means you can see every resource in the machine. I can create organizations with restricted access, and you'll see me do an example of that shortly. Clearly, users are users. What we want to do in this example is we want to integrate our Actifio appliance into Active Directory. So to do this, we go to Configuration Appliance Settings, and we go to the LDAP tab. And in the LDAP tab, we can see in this example, we've already had an AD server set up to communicate with Actifio. So you can see its IP address, we can see the username Actifio is using to log into it, we can see the domain name saactifio.com all set up. Now if I'm adding a new user or I've got doubts about the one we're using, I can use the test button. But the real work here is simply mapping LDAP groups, which will appear here when we fetch them from the server, to Actifio roles, which are here. And then we map the two together and we'll get a new line down the bottom here. So what we'll now do is work through an example of the actual tasks that need to be done to integrate one to the other. So we're going to start back on our AD server. So within Active Directory, I have this concept of security groups and users. So from an administration perspective, when we're going to integrate Actifio with Active Directory, we might want to consider creating new security groups. We can then put existing users into these new security groups, and then in Actifio map these new groups to Actifio roles. You could, if you had an existing group such as backup admins, you could map that straight to the Actifio role administrator. So all the backup admins get full administrator access within Actifio. It really depends on what rights we're playing with here. Let's take an example of where I wish to use this to set up some developers. I want to give developers access to Actifio, but I want them to only be able to do certain tasks and only to access certain resources. So I need to use Actifio roles and Actifio organizations to do this. Within AD, I need to do only 3 things. First up, we're going to make ourselves a new group. So this group is going to be named to reflect the new group of users that I'm going to be adding to the system, which is users that are working in the Pod 4. So Pod 4 is a group of servers within our lab, and I'm going to say these are developers who are working in Pod 4. So I'll simply call it Pod 4 Dev. All right, that was rather easy. Now, as I said, we could modify an existing user, but what I'll do is I'm going to make a new user, and you'll see why I make a new user as we get further through this demonstration. So let's imagine an imaginary person called Tony Vanderwood. He could be my brother, and what we'll do is we're going to give him a user logon of avdev. So avdev will be logging into Actifio, which means we need to set avdev up in Active Directory. Now, let's see if I can get this right. Type a password. And I'll do something which any AD administrator would be horrified with. I will simply make it very easy for myself, but I wouldn't recommend you do this in the real world, and just make the password never to expire. Hit next, hit finish, and I've made my user. So, third and final job, I need to take that user and put that user into the group that I made. So remember, I made a group called Pod4Dev. Pod4Dev. If I've checked this, typed this correctly, it will find Pod4Dev and put the user into it. So I'm literally done in AD. I don't have any more tasks left to do here. I've made my group, which I would have only had to do once. I've made my user, which I have to do only once, and I've put the user into the group, which again, I should only have to do once. Now it's time to cut across to Actifio to do the same one-off tasks on the other side. So I'm back here on my Actifio desktop, but I'm logged in as AV, not AVDev, AV. And AV is an administrator. So if I go and look at AV, and if you notice AVDev doesn't exist, but if I double click on AV as a user, I can see that AV has 2 roles, and one of them is actually superfluous, application admin and administrator. Why is application admin superfluous? Because administrator has full access, has full rights. So this is, they always overlay. If I put you in multiple roles, you'll get the rights of all of those roles merged together. In this case, I'm logged in as AV, so I'm effectively a full administrator. Now what I'm not going to do is add AVDev, because that's going to come from the AD server. But I am going to add a new role. I don't have to do this. I could use an existing role, but I want to show you a new role because you might want to consider creating new roles. And this new role is going to reflect, again, the developers that are working in Pod 4. So having decided I'm going to allow some developers into the system, and I'm going to be very boring and not put a description in. So I'm going to create a new role called Pod4Dev. Remember, that matches the group name that I made in AD. It does not need to, but I'm doing that to make my life easier. Now what I need to do is add some rights. So this is the key bit, because clearly this will determine which of these tiles down the bottom the user can access. I'm going to limit it to only 2, and I'm going to give some capability here. Workflow, I'm going to let them look at the system. So I'm letting them basically work with images and hosts, work with looking at what the system state is, and work with workflows. That's the only rights. But you'll notice particularly, they won't get access to all of these tiles here. They'll only get access to 2 of them, Application Manager and System Monitor. And everyone gets access to the dashboard. So That's pod4dev done. Now I'm going to go into organizations. And again, I don't have to use an organization, but I want to do so that you can see an example of one being built. Now remember, this construction of the new role, that's a one-off task. We do that exactly once. The construction of this organization is a one-off task. The only exception is where a role is basically fixed. It's unlikely you'll change it. The organization you may well choose to change because you may well choose to, well, in fact, you may well discover that there are new resources being added to the system all the time. So I'm going to make this organization called pod4org. Now, having gotten into pod4org, I've created it. I'm now gone to the ownership tab, and you can see there's a whole bunch of resource types. The two that I'm particularly interested in are hosts and apps. Now, the host is all about what the user can mount to. Now, the neat trick here is that everything in pod4 has a 4 at the end of it. So there I am, 3 hosts that the user can get to. They can mount to any of these 3 hosts. So remember, a developer, really why are they in Actifio? They probably want to get access to images and mount them to servers so they can work on them. So giving them access to hosts they can mount to is fairly important. And then I want to add some resources. So again, I'm going to make my life easy. I'm just going to put a 4 in here. And I'm going to look for anything that has 4 in it. So SQL 4, Management 4, Oracle 4, SQL 4. All of these are things that come from pod4, so I'll happy for the person to see them. So they're all of the source resources, if you like. Now, what I'll now do is there is one database, and it's rather delightfully called BigDB, and it's living on Oracle Prod. And I also want the user to have access to that resource, so I'll hit save on that. And what I've now got is a list of all of the apps and the hosts that a user in pod4org can see. So I have one more task to do, which is that I need to map the LDAP group that I made to the Actifio role and organization that I made. Remember, all of these are one-off tasks. You do them only once. After that, every user that's put into that LDAP group will get the relevant role and org. So this is relatively low maintenance. I only have to do this once. So we're going to now do the mapping of the group to the org. So all we need to do to map an LDAP group to an Actifio role is hit the Fetch Groups button. A group of LDAP groups will appear here. I select the one that I'm interested in. I select the Actifio role I wish to map to, and I hit Map. It's as simple as that. You can see I've already done the mapping here because I can see that pod4dev LDAP group has been mapped to Actifio pod4dev role. So what this means is that any user from now on put into that LDAP group, when they log into Actifio, will be given that role. So it's very easy for me to determine the role of every user who logs in from now on. And when those new users log in, they'll appear here underneath this list. They don't appear here till they've been authorized by AD. So let's test it out. Let's have a look at what happens. So to test it out, I'm going to log in as my user avdev with the password that I set in AD. Remember, that was the password that I may never expire. And I'm going to hit sign in. Now, if you remember, the ADDev user did not exist, which means that Actifio has now fetched the group and is now mapping the group to an Actifio role. And here's the interesting thing. Do you remember I set the group to only allow access to 2 tiles, Application Manager and System Monitor? So we know the role-based access control is working. However, I have a little unfortunate discovery, which is that I can't see any organizational resources. Why not? Well, the answer is that I never actually mapped the Actifio org to the AD group. Now, if you remember, I didn't see a GUI option for that, and the reason is there isn't one. We need to use the CLI. So what we're going to do now is log into the CLI and set that part of the RBAC up. So what I'm now going to do is SSH into my Actifio appliance using the AV admin. So AV. AV is an administrator, and because I've set up CLI access for AV, which is done using keys, then I can access Actifio using the CLI. Now, there are only 2 types of command I'm interested in, UDS info commands and UDS task commands. And the best way to find a particular command is to use grep. So grep is a Unix utility that lets you search. So what I'm saying to Actifio is UDS info minus question mark lists all the UDS info commands, the commands to give me information. Grep or pipe, that's the pipe symbol, to grep, which is search for the word LDAP. So in other words, hey, give me all the informational commands and search through them for ones that have the word LDAP in them. Now, these are the ones I want, and I'll show you why in a moment. UDS task commands are commands that do actions. So I'm going to grep for the word LDAP in the tasks. And the command I'm interested in is UDS task make LDAP group org. So this will map a organizational to an LDAP group. Now, again, if I was to just run this command, it says, hey, you didn't tell me what you wanted. I need to use the minus question mark to get an example of a running command. And if I look down the bottom of the example, this is it. This is what I need. So it's telling me you need the ID of the group and the ID of the org. Okay, I think I can get these. In fact, I already know the command for the ID of the group. So if I do UDS info space ls LDAP group, this one here, this will give me all my LDAP groups. Look, pod4dev. I've got the ID of pod4dev. So I've got the first part of this command here, the group ID. Now I need the org ID. UDS info ls org. And look, pod4org. I've got the org ID. So I now combine the two together. So with two commands, I learnt the group ID, this number, and the org ID, which is this number. And when I run the two together, I get a number back, which actually tells me it's gone and created a relationship between the two. So if I do a UDS info, and remember I had a whole bunch of commands here, ls LDAP group org, I can see that group 220.28743, this guy here, is mapped to that org, this guy here. So I know the mapping now exists. I'm done in the CLI. It's now time for AVDev to have another go at logging in. So let's bring up the Actifio desktop. Now that's AV, we don't want AV. So what we want though is a new blank desktop, which we'll bring up right here. I'll pop that over the top. So we know that no one's logged in at the moment, it's no sleight of hand. AVDev is going to have another go at logging in now that we've mapped the org to the LDAP group. How will we know if this has worked? AVDev will be able to see applications, which we couldn't see before. And what do you know? We can now see our applications, so we know that AVDev is now ready to roll. Now, as I said, from an administration setup perspective, nearly everything I did is a one-off task. Making the LDAP group, one-off task. Putting the user in the LDAP group, one-off task. Making the Actifio role and mapping it to the LDAP group, a one-off task. And again, making the Actifio organization and mapping it to the LDAP group is a one-off task. Once all those things are done, from then on, all we need to do is add new users to the LDAP groups in AD and potentially add new resources to the Actifio organization. That's it. So I've significantly simplified my administration and maintenance going forward, and I've done that using a corporate approved tool in the form of Active Directory. All right, thank you very much.